Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Deepa, for having me here. Today, we'll talk about building UI components using Storybook.js. My name is Deepa. I'm a QA developer at Adobe. I also enjoy building front-end and full-stack applications. I'm a part of Google Developer Group as an organizer. I'm also an ambassador at Women Tech Makers. I do write blogs. And here's the base that you can connect with me is through LinkedIn, and every slide on the top right would have my Twitter handle. And fun fact about me is I'm an avid coffee drinker. So today I assume that you have the following knowledge already. So you should have familiarity with HTML and CSS. You should know JavaScript, ES6, features, arguments, parameters, etc. And you have worked already with a React application. You know how to create a React application, what is a component, what is JSX, fragments, etc. So the agenda for today is we'll start off with something called as component-driven development. And then we'll deep dive into Storybook. Where does it fit inside component-driven development? What is it? Why you need to use Storybook? And what are the companies that use Storybook? And we'll see how to write stories. We can add controls to our stories using arguments, parameters, decorators, etc. And we'll also talk about how to add, how to install an add-on. By default, Storybook comes with add-ons, but we can also see one of the add-ons and see how an installable add-on works. Finally, we'll wrap it up with a Q&A. So just to give you a visual, this is an evolving front-end development graph that I picked up from online. As you can see, this graph starts off at 1995 and it goes till 2019. Which is not too recent, but at the same time, a lot of things are holds true even today. So if you see in the JavaScript ecosystem at the bottom, there's a lot going on from the past decade or so. Angular started coming up in AngularJS started coming up in 2011-ish, and then you have React. Then React Native came up, Vue, and now in 2015 or so, Angular came. And then there's also changes to the ECMAScript, if you see. So there's a lot more that's going on in front-end development. So this is making this evolving front-end is very tricky these days to build UI, right? So what do we have now? So what are the ways that we could make our lives easier? So there's something called as component-driven development. Tom Coleman introduced this in 2017. He describes the shift in UI development towards component architectures and processes. So the idea of modular UI has many parallels when you see in software moments such as microservices and containerization. What Tom says is that you need to build UI from bottoms up, right? So you start building from bottom, and then you end it up at a page or a screen level, right? So here are the steps. You start building one component at a time, one piece of component. For example, you add an input or a button. Then you combine it combine those components inside of a form, right? And then when you assemble them inside and assemble the form inside a page, for example, a sign up page, right? So then where you can mark it with the data. And finally, you integrate your pages along with the backend services and APIs. So this is one of the architecture that you have. There's other architecture like micro frontends too. So what is Storybook? Storybook is a development environment and a playground for creating UI components in isolation. Right? It's a sandbox environment. It runs outside of your React application or Angular, whatever framework or a library that you pick up. So it does not need any logic, business logic, and you don't need any APIs or data to make this work. You just focus on component level development here. So why in isolation? Because we are focusing at a component level and not thinking of a page level, it becomes easier for you to create these components, and you also ensure the quality of your software that you're building improves due to this isolation. And when you're working in large teams, the communication between teams becomes easier. We'll see that in a moment. So why Storybook? Like I said, we are building this in isolation. Imagine a React application looking like this, right? You have so many components. Think of Instagram, Facebook, Airbnb. They have so many UI components, and think of how do we create these things, create these UI components. How do we interact? How do we see how the interaction goes? And how do we test them, right? Whether they look and feel in different ways. And as you, I'll be showing you how Storybook looks in the playground and how you can see the environment as such. So Storybook makes it super easy and super simple when you're building components in isolation. So Storybook supports TypeScript and JavaScript. So Angular users can use them. And it also supports other frameworks too. Because you're creating this in isolation, if you want to see how your whole UI renders, you can also check the performance using their add-ons. So Storybook also has an add-on for accessibility, where you can make sure that your components are accessible, so that when you integrate them as pages, your page becomes accessible too. So it's a very neat tool. I'll show you an example of how to install accessibility and a small snippet of how, when you run this installed add-on, how accessibility looks like, right? And you can also test your UI using Jest and Playwright. Now, how do you install it? So first, you need to have your React or your Angular app. Remember that Storybook works only outside of your application, but you need to have your application there for Storybook to work. So then you install Storybook. By default, it installs in Yarn. If you want to use Node, you can use this flag. And if you want to run your Storybook on localhost, you run this command. And Storybook has just released with their version 7. Sometimes it might throw some error. Make sure that you upgrade Storybook, and then it should be good to go. Now let's see, how the project folder looks inside of Storybook. This is the project folder after I installed Storybook. Here, as you can see in the left, let me just, this is my React app called My App. And as you have two folders, .storybook and stories inside of source folder. And if I go ahead and click on the .storybook, there are two files, main.js and preview.js. Now let's go take a look at main.js. Main.js is an entry point for Storybook. So basically it looks for all the files that contains .stories as an extension. And as you can see, it says .stories, it can be a JavaScript file or a TypeScript file. And also when you install Storybook, it has a add-on that comes up with this. So this is where if you want to install something in Storybook, if you want to add on an installation, this is where it will show up. So in preview.js, this is mainly for both these files are for configuration purposes only. So preview.js is a configuration file for global. If you want to assign something globally to a story. For example, I want to add I'll be showing you an example of how do you add a background to a button, right? You can do that using the preview.js. And you can also, if you want to customize all your components in an alphabetical order, and you want to make sure it is in this in some kind of an order. You can sort them using mentioning all those things inside of preview.js. So whenever you make changes to either main.js or preview.js, you need to restart or rerun Storybook again. And now let's go take a look at the source folder where I have stories. And as you can see, there are three files for buttons. One is for styling. One contains a React code, and then we also have stories for this button here. So if you see this, there is a button component, a header component. There is something called as introduction.stories.ndx, which is nothing but a document file. I'll show you how it looks like in the Storybook playground. And there's also a component for page. So now let's go ahead and take a look at how it looks in the local host, right? Here's the introduction.mdx file. If you see here, there are a couple of, it usually shows up in the canvas. And this is just, it is very similar to how do you write a README documentation, right? Very similar to it. There is also ways that you can add code snippets into this. And there are documentation for this in Storybook, if you can go ahead and take a look. And this is very similar to the project structure we saw, right? There's a button component, there is a header component, and there is a page component. And inside the button component, you see there are 4 stories. So a component contains of many stories. Here, each and every story is laid out separately. And if you see, there are controls here. Just to mention that this part of Storybook is the toolbar. And the whole thing, this is a toolbar where you can see the background that you can set it up. There is also a viewport here, whether you can set it up for small or large or a tablet size, and you can reset it as well. So this is the toolbar. So down below here is the control panel where you have controls, actions, and interaction. By default, these add-ons comes with Storybook when you install them. Here, we know in this primary button here, there are a lot of controls. So for example, if I go ahead and toggle this, so I can set this to set this button as not a primary one. And I can also go ahead and change the label of it to say my button, right? And instantly it changes. So if I want to choose a different color for this button background, I can go ahead and do so as well. So here you go. The button color has also changed instantly. And I can also go ahead and pick the sizing for this button. I can do small, medium. By default, it was a medium. Now I can go ahead and do it enlarged as well. So this is how you can add controls. Make sure that when I made changes to this story, the secondary button did not have any changes. So you can customize your controls for each and every story. And now let's go ahead and see what is inside the header. So here I have Jane Doe as a text. So let's go ahead and change this to Geekle. So it's a string, so I need to make sure it's in quotes. Once I do this, so it reflects on the top right? And also see that these are required field, this login and logout. If I click on logout, watch out on the actions tab here. So if I do that, there's an action event that fires up. It gives you what is this event all about and what did we do? Here we made a click event. So that's if I go ahead and do the same thing with sign up, it's going to show up the actions as well here. So now let's move on to page. This page story would have, here we don't have any controls to it, but I just wanted to show how interactions work with page. If I go ahead and say it's logged in, now if I go ahead and see in the logged in, it shows the interaction. Just because I said login, it fired up this interaction too. So this is how Storybook, looks. This playground looks, and as you can see, it's very easy to navigate through this and look into the UI. And also, I wanted to show something here in package.json. See, Storybook is installed as a dev dependency. Here you can see there are some essential add-ons, interactions, links, and you would see the same thing in main.js too. So this is how Storybook looks when you install them. And we'll also talk about how to add your own controls, and we'll see from there. So now, what are the different types of components we can have in Storybook, right? We saw default, there were default components, but you can also create other components such as footer or inputs or table or anything, or an action bar. So for example, we at Adobe use Storybook for creating all our components. So here is this is an open source project. You can go ahead and take a look at this. And just to give you, I just took a partial screenshot of what are the components that we have it in Storybook. So as you can see, there are badges, banners, button groups, cards, dividers, dialogues, and there are a lot more. So you can create as many components as possible, and this way you can share it across your teams. Adobe has different products, but our UI has to look very similar across different products as well. So we use Storybook for this purpose. And we talked about this. This is how Storybook works. Storybook looks in the playground. The essential add-ons are your toolbar and your panel, which contains control, actions, and interactions. And also you have, we talked about documents that you can create. This comes as an essential add-on inside, where you can see it inside of package.json and in main.js as well. So this is what we saw. So what does these add-ons do? This add-ons gives you all these things. You can set up backgrounds, right? So now moving on to what is a story, right? A story is a function that describes how to render a component. So it describes all the state inside a story. So let's see how to write a story for a button in a moment. So here's an example for button story. And if you see here, there are two exports. One is a default export. The other one is a named export, right? So in the default export, you have properties such as title, and the title is mandatory, and it must be unique. So this is what you will see it in the side panel of the playground in Storybook. When I say forms.button, forms is a component, and inside the forms, there is a button story. So this is how it is organized, and you can have as many, like how I showed it in Adobe's component stuff. You can have as many as you want, but make sure that these are unique, right? And there is a named export. These are React components, and they represent individual stories. For example, here I have a submit button, next button, and the OK button, cancel button. Each one of these are individual stories. And as you can see, there are different variations too. Just give me a moment to show the screenshot of this. See, this is what we have created using this. And as you can see, there are in different colors, but there's no controls added because this is a custom button that I've created. There's no controls. So how do we add controls? You can add controls using the following ways, but there are a lot more, many other features, but I'm going to be mentioning only these three today. We can add controls using parameters, arguments, and decorators. So here's an example for how do you add a parameter for controlling your component, right? Parameters basically are methods that defines static metadata for your stories, right? It provides configuration to various add-ons. Here is an example of how do you create a background for a button for a button component. So for example, I have cyan, blue color, green color, and red color, right? So let's see how it looks in action in Storybook Playground.
So the background is now in red. So if I go ahead and change this to cyan, I can do that, and all the stories will have the background of cyan. And if I want to change it, I can go change it to blue or any other color that I want to have. So this is how you would define, or you would add parameters to your stories.
We saw an example of parameters. Now let's see how we can add arguments to your stories. So you can add arguments at a story level or at a component level. Arguments are nothing but objects. In a JavaScript, objects are nothing but key value pairs. And as you can see, I have added, this is an example for adding an argument for a success button. So I have used Material UI code here. So what it does is it'll show you can only use certain key value pairs that is mentioned along with Material UI too. So if you're using any design system, make sure that you follow their documentation, and based on that, you can assign key value pair. I'll just show you, and also note that we are using template.bind, which is nothing but a JavaScript technique to make a copy of a function. So we copy the template so that you can, so that each exported story has its own property. We can export it to different buttons that we are creating too. So here's a demo for arguments.
Example for Material UI button that I have added, I have imported. For the success button, I have 3 arguments inside, and arguments are nothing but objects, and you can use it along with a template bind so that you can make a copy of it. This is a JavaScript technique to copy a function. So if I go ahead and see in the Storybook Playground here, I can see those arguments here. I can go ahead and change this to, for example, I can go ahead and change this to OK, right? And I can also change the variant to, because we are using Material UI, we can only use certain values that Material UI has in their documentation. I can use this as outlined one. Outline, make sure that you don't make any typo, otherwise it will not work. I can make a click, and also I can say text. These are arguments that are supported by Material UI. So now it's a text, it shows it as a text. Now if I go back to say contained, it'll show as info. So also each of these can be changed for every single story. This is how you can define arguments.
Now moving on to decorators, right? So how do we use decorators inside our stories? So it's a simple way of wrapping one piece of code to another. Basically, you're decorating it. If you see on the code snippet here, we are adding a decorator for our success button, and we are making small tweaks for our styling. So we are basically adding a margin. We are adding a styling or decorating it, and saying that the margin has to be 3M. This is how you would add decorators to your stories.
Now let us see how to add decorators, right? For the same button, Material UI button, I'm adding decorators. Decorators are nothing but you add it for some decorative purposes. For example, here I have added a margin of 1M inside the success button and inside the error button too. So if I go ahead and change this thing to 15M, for example, now it looks like this. Here, if I go ahead and change this to 15M on both success and in the error button, if I go ahead and see, now as you can see, it has moved away. See, the margin has moved. So this is how you would use arguments and decorators inside of Storybook.
So we saw how to create decorators, but there are different ways that you can create decorators. You can create one at a component level, a story level, or a global level. We saw one example. If we create something inside, like how I showed you before, we can add a component decorator using those decorators inside of default export, right? So here is a way you can define your component decorator inside of your default export. So if I do this, I've added a margin. It shows up for all the buttons here. It has added those margins. And then finally, it says, okay, your margin is added, right? You basically add the styling inside of a default export. So for a story decorator, you need to do the same thing inside a named export. If you use it along with a bind method and you're creating for a specific story, then it comes under, you write the same code inside a named export. So now, what is a global decorator? Global decorators are decorators for all stories that you want to have via a decorators export inside of preview.js. If you remember, there's a .storybook folder, and inside that preview.js is there. And if you want to add a global decorator, this is where you would do it. So far, we saw what are the add-ons that came up with Storybook. And I also mentioned that we can install add-ons, right? You can install add-ons like for accessibility, performance, and for testing. Here, I'll give you an example for adding an accessibility add-on. Once I go ahead and run in Storybook, you have to look for that add-on inside the Storybook documentation. There is a command for adding the accessibility one. And once I add that, it'll show up in your main.js file. So here, once I add that, it'll show up in all my stories. It'll add if you see in the panel, it added accessibility. And this accessibility is available to all through your stories. It can be for the button component, it can be for the message, and all the components that you've created. And it also gives you certain indexes. So for example, although this button has passed, there is no violation and it passes, but it also tells you, hey, you could improve this or make it more accessible by fixing these things, right? It gives you certain levels of accessibility, such as, oh, this is a critical accessibility issue that you might want to address. And there are serious ones and there are warning ones. Warning ones are generally not, you have to basically pick up the critical and serious one. And if you click on the more info link on the panel, it would take you to DQ University. It is a organization that basically lays out how your accessibility should be for a website. So they'll give you code snippets as how do you improve, and you can take a look at that. And based on that, you can make your components accessible. When you make components accessible, finally, you make your pages accessible as well. So now we've talked a lot about Storybook. Let's see wrap it up with some of its benefits. As I said, you are developing these things in isolation, so it's more durable, and you can test, each of your components separately, and then because of that, there's less effort and there's no flakiness. And there's also a possibility that you can create documentation and you can share it across teams and they can all reuse it. So basically you write once and then you can reuse everywhere. Like I said, you can share, and overall it improves your code quality. So what are the companies that use a Storybook, right? At Adobe, we use Storybook, and Microsoft uses this. And there are so many companies. There are over 30,000 applications that use Storybook for their development work. If you go to Storybook page and look for Showcase, there's a lot of companies that are listed there, and different components that you can take a look at. Probably you can start customizing it for your own needs. So here is an example that I added for how, as a whole, Storybook would look like.
It's an example of of an application, which is nothing but a virtual or a hypothetical coffee store. So I've created, this example, I picked it up from GitHub. So it has a item card, there's a card one, and there's button with a default one, and then there's footer, there's a card, and header has something called as some awesome coffee, and this is a text, and also there's a card, checkout card. And once you run the whole thing in a local host, the page looks something like this. So this is a coffee shop where you have all these products, where I can go ahead and search for cappuccino. If I go, and it's unfortunate that the cappuccinos have pizzas instead. So if I go ahead and clear this, and it just picks up random images from Unsplash. So here is a code snippet of all the, here is where I am trying to run this thing. So this is a coffee shop example. This is an item called item one, and there's a story here for the heading, and then there's also there's an API for, basically it's a mock data that's coming from for all the images, and it's coming up from this. So this is how you can use Storybook, and you can put all the components together and make it work for your web application. I hope this demo helped you to understand how Storybook can be useful.
So to summarize, we talked a lot about Storybook. Why do we have to build components in isolation? What are its benefits? How you can create stories at a component level, at a story level, and as a global level as well. There is a lot more to this. This is just a very small, quick demo of how Storybook you can start using Storybook for your projects, right? And we also talked about add-ons. Showed you how to use accessibility here. So with this knowledge, you can take it to the next level. You can start you can see how you can integrate it with an API, or write the same thing in Angular with TypeScript, right? And you can also see how you can test it. So the possibilities are a lot if you want to explore this particular tool. So once again, my name is Deepa. You can connect with me in LinkedIn, and you can also check out our events at GDG San Jose. And here are my references. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.